Take a look at this image and try and figure out what on earth is happening here. I'll describe what you can see, but I'm not going to reveal the answer. That will come later on in the lesson. So we have a woman hanging out of a building. At the bottom, we've got a couple of guys who are holding onto her ankles. At the top, we've got a couple of guys holding onto her wrist. And there's some sort of smoke just next to her, seems to be falling down. So pause the video, maybe scribble down an idea, or find out what's happening in a few minutes' time. So this lesson we're looking at how the Berlin Wall affected the Cold War. We'll be focused on both the short-term and the longer-term consequences of this city being divided into two. We've got a diagram of what the Berlin Wall looked like towards the end of the Cold War. So this is in 1983, the wall falls in 1989. Remember we said last lesson that to begin with, the Berlin Wall wasn't really a wall. It was barbed wire fences, barriers and hundreds of guards patrolling it. The reason this was done overnight was to prevent as many East Berliners as possible from secretly going into West Berlin. If it had been announced beforehand, Khrushchev would have had an even bigger brain drain just before the borders closed. As time went on, the East German government was able to pour more and more money into widening and strengthening these barriers. So what you'd normally think of as the Berlin Wall is on the leftmost part of this diagram. You'll notice it's got rounded tops to prevent people from climbing over. Obviously that wouldn't stop someone with a ladder, and you'd think that'd just be easy to do that. But the problem is, you can't get the ladder over there. There's so many different defences before you get to the wall. So on the easternmost or rightmost section, there's just a standard concrete wall, nothing too intimidating. It's relatively high, but no more defences than that. You might have electrified fences at certain points, assuming the electricity is running. You've got white sand or white gravel right in the middle, which is harshly lit up by floodlights at all hours of the day, so it's easy to see someone's footprints or someone trying to stretch across that distance. Obviously, you'll have many different patrols. There's guard towers, vehicles, borders, and guard dogs. And after that, you've even got things such as mines or pit traps or spikes hidden in the gravel. The idea there is to make it as unpleasant as possible to cross. So not only might you be shot, and many hundred will be shot and killed, but even if you're not killed, you are going to be marked as someone who tried to escape. Now, if you were using the Word document on Schoology for last lesson, go back to that. There's a couple more details to add. If you aren't using that Word document, I'd recommend using the headings on these PowerPoint slides to help guide your notes. There's also pages 42 to 44 in the textbook if you want even more information on this. Now, East German guards are guarding the wall from 1961 up until 1989. There are thousands of them doing this at any one time. It's a massive drain on the East German government's budget. Those guards are told to shoot anyone attempting to get into West Berlin, and at least 140 people are killed in this way. It could be as high as 240, but records are a little bit unsure, and it also depends on if you die in prison after the attempt. Does that count or not? Having said that, over 5,000 people did successfully cross into West Berlin. Most of those, the overwhelming majority of those, are in the first few years of the wall. After around 1970 or 1980, it becomes much harder simply because the defences are so much more impressive to overcome. In terms of the results for the Cold War, the brain drain was stopped completely. This is a massive success for Khrushchev. Remember, it's one of the main reasons he built the wall in the first place. Because there are only now a certain amount of ways to cross into West Berlin, and therefore cross into West Germany, you need to get specific permission from the East German government to do so. And even if you have a particularly good reason, let's say you're a professor of computing and you want to go to a West German university to give a lecture, a lot of the time you will be refused because they fear that once you're in West Germany, you won't come back. The reason they fear it is that it kept on happening. Khrushchev, meanwhile, claimed that the building of the Berlin Wall was a way to guard the gates of socialist or communist paradise. Now that's obviously nonsense. If you think back to the diagram in the previous slide, the defences are all pointed towards the east, towards the communist side. It's actually a lot easier to go from West Germany or West Berlin into East Germany or East Berlin because they will welcome you in. It'll be a great propaganda victory for them. West German guards will stop you, but they're not going to shoot you like an East German guard might trying to go into West Berlin. Now, In terms of relations between the superpowers, the Potsdam Agreement was shattered. It had already been tested and probably broken by Stalin and the West. If you think of Bisonia, Trisonia, and the Deutschmark, all of those are Western decisions on part of Germany. So that's violating the Potsdam Agreement for unified decisions on Germany. And of course, Stalin's Berlin blockade in 1948 is restricting access into West Berlin to try and starve it out and make it join East Berlin. But after the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961, there's no question that the Potsdam Agreement is no longer being respected. In the 1970s and 1980s, no one really refers to it anymore because they know it's a dead dream. More pressingly for our course, Khrushchev saw the building of the Berlin Wall as a success because Kennedy didn't act strongly. As a result, he looked for other ways to press him, and next lesson we'll look at the most explosive example of that, if you'll pardon the awful pun, the Cuban Missiles Crisis in 1962. Now, in terms of how Kennedy did respond, he visited West Berlin in 1963. He gave a rousing, incredible, emotional speech to 200,000 people near the centre of Berlin. In this speech, he gave famous words, probably the most famous quote across all of the Cold War, Ich bin ein Berliner, which means I am a Berliner. Now, you might hear an urban legend that says that in German, that means I am a donut or I'm a jelly donut. It's complete nonsense. It was misprinted and misrepresented by American newspapers. Ich bin ein Berliner does make complete sense. But the idea of Ich bin ein Berliner is that Kennedy is a Berliner. Kennedy is a German, even though he's clearly not. He's saying, I stand with the German people. Then he got into a plane, went to America, and never did anything ever again. Now, part of the reason he'd never did anything again is that he was killed in the same year. But even if he hadn't been assassinated, he wouldn't have done much more. He has privately said that a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. So publicly, he condemned Khrushchev. Publicly, he said that Americans will help Germans and Berliners in particular. But even if he'd been president for another 6 years, he wouldn't have done much, I don't think, because there isn't a lot of actions for him to do. That leads on to a stretch and challenge. Can you try and figure out what he could do? Were there economic punishments he could do? Is there some sort of political agreement that could be made? Obviously, military actions are out of the question, because any military action in Berlin would definitely spark World War III, thanks to NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So you might say, in other hand, actually, doing nothing was the best possible action for Kennedy. So even though he got massively criticised for it, especially by American news media, doing nothing could be the best action. We're going to have a look at how each side portrayed or showed the Berlin Wall. The first thing you need to know is that the East don't call it the Berlin Wall, they call it the Anti-Fascist Protection Barrier. A fascist, if you're not sure, is essentially a Nazi. Remember that Khrushchev described the wall as guarding the gates of the socialist or communist paradise. That means that in the West, against the communists must be the evil Nazis, which is obviously ridiculous because both sides, both the communists and the West, worked together to defeat the Nazis. But once the Nazis were defeated, it made sense to use them as a boogeyman, as like a ghost or an evil monster, and attack the West for it. The West obviously describe it as the Berlin Wall. We've got a bit of propaganda in itself here. You've got a map from a West German company which shows Berlin divided into two with an ominous looking wall in the middle of it. Now, this is made in 1962 before a full wall has been created. So in 1962 they're making it, they're building it, but it's not the full fortifications that you've come to expect from that earlier diagram. Now, I've got a link in the description for the Eastern propaganda. This is made in 1971. The full title is something like A Lesson Not Learned, and it's warning about the evils of fascism across the border into West Berlin. So pause this video and have a look at the other video that I've linked and try and write down a few things to describe how the East are portraying or showing the wall. I've taken a couple of stills from the cartoon to give you an idea of how this propaganda worked. So you've got a Nazi being looked after by American or Western guards. They've even washed his Nazi uniform, so he's going to look incredibly impressive. Towards the top right, you've got the ghost of Adolf Hitler happily marching along. The guy's holding a sign saying 1937. I'd be very surprised if you knew the importance of that day, but that is the year in which Hitler announced his plans to his government that he was planning to invade the East. And obviously he's marching eastwards towards places like Poland or the Soviet Union. On the bottom left, we've got the idea of revanchism, which is the idea of taking back stolen or taken land. So they are seeing the wall as a way of preventing this revanchism. We've taken the land from the Nazis and now they want to take it back. And then finally, towards the end, very quickly, you saw this statue of loads of flags around it. That's actually a real statue in modern day Russia, celebrating the Russian or the Soviet defeat of Nazi Germany. And all around are different Eastern European flags. So the idea is that all in it together, they're all happy and willing to fight Nazis again if they need to. So I'll have a look at the Western propaganda and it'll be very much the same. Now, for the American or Western propaganda, I think it's worth playing another game of propaganda bingo. I've had literally hundreds of students emailing in, just banging on my door saying, "Sir, we need to play propaganda bingo again." So I thought, fine, you've been good, you've got this far, I'll let you play it again. So if you didn't play the first round, I'll explain what you need to do. You need to come up with 9 things you think you might see in an American bit of propaganda about the Berlin Wall. Now, this propaganda is made in 1962, 1 year after the Berlin Wall was made. By this point, you're starting to see the wall as you might remember it, but you haven't got the many, many layers of defence that you would see before. So come up with 9 things you might see or hear or somehow experience in this propaganda. So think about all of these sorts of questions. Try to consider how the situation was different to the Berlin blockade and airlift. So one really important way in which it's different is that the propaganda you saw for the Berlin airlift was after the airlift has been a success. And obviously in 1962, the Berlin Wall is still ongoing. They have no idea how long it will last, but in the video, they don't think it will be over anytime soon. Now, if you're struggling for ideas, I've got a load of different suggestions here. I've deliberately put things in here which you won't see as well. There are 9 things here which you'll definitely find. So have a look at these, come up with your own ideas, watch the video, and then come back to this one. So all of the red things here are things you don't see in the propaganda video. So it's very, very sad and dramatic. There's not a lot of hopeful music at all. Obviously, it wouldn't show any problems in West Berlin, unless the problem is how to get East Berliners in. It doesn't have any ominous or evil footage of Khrushchev or Ulbricht. They don't want to focus on the leaders. They want to focus on the human side of this. And even the humans of the guards, they're not even really seen as humans, are they? They're kind of seen as like these evil robots doing the bidding of some mysterious power in the East. They don't compare it to Stalin, and they certainly don't compare it to the Berlin blockade or airlift. Because remember, the airlift was a success, but there is no hint of any success coming soon with the building of the Berlin Wall. Now have a look at that stretch and challenge. In that clip, somewhere towards the middle, it says 12,000 people escaped in the first year of the wall. But previously I told you around 5,000 escaped across the entire wall, nearly 40 years worth. Try and have a think about why this is such an error. Now there's some innocent explanations and there's some less innocent explanations. In terms of less innocent explanations, it could just be an out and out lie. It sounds good, doesn't it? 12,000. And it sounds more specific and therefore more believable than something like 10,000. If you round it up or down to something like that, it's kind of harder to swallow. More innocent explanations could simply be that how they're calculating someone who goes across the wall is different. Many of those thousands will be family members who have been given permission by the East German government to return into West Germany. But modern historians don't count that into their estimates because they should already have been in West Berlin. So take your level of cynicism as much as you want. You could just say this is an out and out lie from Americans, or you could just say it's different ways of calculating it. Now, the final thing we need to do today is have a think about, was the wall better than a war? Remember, that was one of the quotes that Kennedy said in private. He didn't want people to know that he actually was okay with the wall because it was the least worst alternative. Again, on that Word document, there's a separate page which you can cut up, or if you're using something else, you can just use these slides here. Cut them up and organize them into either positive or negative results for the building of the Berlin Wall. How did this affect the Cold War? There's one or two where you might think actually it's not particularly positive or negative. It doesn't really affect the situation at all. If you want to go even further, you might try and rank them in order of importance. So to be incredibly cruel, for example, you might say something like C, around 200 people were killed. It's not actually massive in terms of the grand scale of the Cold War. So you might say, while that is awful, it's not a massively important negative consequence. So I've color coded these according to whether they are negative, red, positive, green, or not really either way, not really affecting it for blue. Now, if you think about cards B and I, for Khrushchev, the wall is a massive success because it basically stops the brain drain completely. On the other hand, the very fact they had to build the wall shows that the window to the west hadn't been solved. Obviously, you can no longer just travel across the road to visit your brother or anything like that and see that their life is so much better, but you know that the wall is there because their lives are so much better to stop you from going over it. So it increased resentment for many East Berliners. The window to the west problem is not solved. In terms of the propaganda, both sides are using it, so both sides are attacking the other because of the wall, so that's clearly affecting the situation badly. You also have the fact, however, with G, that no USSR leader tries to take West Berlin like Stalin had in the Berlin blockade. We said that the Berlin blockade was the first major confrontation between the two. The Berlin Wall prevents something like that ever happening again. Even if a later leader had wanted to take West Berlin, the act of taking down the wall would be admitting that the Berlin Wall was a mistake. So it kind of forces Khrushchev and any subsequent leader into never taking West Berlin. Now, the final thing we think about is that stretch and challenge. In the short term, Khrushchev made a sensible decision for East Germany and communism. So if you think about B in particular, it does stop that brain drain. The East German government and the East German economy is able to kind of take a breather and recover and start to increasing far more than it ever did. You could even try to split it up in terms of those different themes. If you think economically and politically, or maybe ideologically, so the ideas of communism and capitalism, in what ways was the Berlin Wall a sensible decision for Khrushchev, at least in the short term? That's everything you need to know about the building of the Berlin Wall and the results of it, right up to the end of the Cold War. Next couple of lessons, we'll look at the Cuban Missiles Crisis in 1962. After that, we'll look at the Prague Spring and invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. You'll notice we've spent a lot of time on this, far more than even a big topic before, like the Berlin blockade and airlift or NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Each of these are content areas which could be a whole question on itself. So you need to make sure that you really, really understand these. So far more than any other lesson beforehand, it'd make a lot of sense to just quickly read over your notes from this lesson and last lesson. Can you explain the causes, the events, and the results of the Berlin Wall? Maybe 3 points of detail for each of those things.